Good.
And we have, oh, Eric made it, okay.
So
So,
if we're going with introductions, I think we are still in a chivalrous world. However,
Yeah.
that might work. But Stacy, why don't you go first?
Original budget.
Hate introducing myself. I'm Stacy. I'm here in New York. I'm here just to learn more about the topic so that I can share more. And I am a member of Open Global Mind.
okay, thanks. Sunil, you want to go next?
Yeah, I'm on this call because I'm all over the place most of the time. But these areas of the convergence of climate change and food security and food on the table and all of that. And Klaus, I think, knows a little bit about it. About 2 years ago, we started an experiment in my company to do hydroponics, soilless agriculture, basically, but in a distributed sort of way, rather than the monoliths and the corporate way of doing it. How about people being given the knowledge and the assistance to be able to grow some part of their own produce? I wouldn't call it food, but whatever would grow in those places. And then as one went along, one could actually create a sort of an ecosystem. Because my sense is that, at least in India, where I come from, so I'm based out of New Delhi in India. I run a company that I co-founded that's called Idea Farms. And Stacy, we've met a couple of times on different forums, I'm sure. I remember, right? So while we were on that experiment, what I found was that at least in India, where we've had the green revolution that started in the 50s, the adoption of technology has been very, very slow and it's been quite random, So being from a technology sort of a background, I'm not a technologist or a coding programming type of a person, but I understand how technology can really be deployed and maximized to be able to create the kind of impact that one can. Not that I'm claiming that I'm right all the time, but I love to experiment with this kind of stuff because that's the only way you can figure out, what needs to be scaled and what isn't working. So the reason I came on this call was, I think, Klaus, if you remember, 2 years ago, I said, Klaus, what do you think? This whole distributed balcony agriculture, soilless or whatever.
Yeah, I
Do you
remember.
think that yeah, and you were kind enough to even, we had a call just on that specific thing, you and I one-on-one for this company that you had worked for, the Metro group. So what we have done in the meantime is that we've kind of prototyped and partially tested what is called we felt, one of the key things is that real-time information is not available to people who would like to grow this. So it's not just in hydroponics, balcony agriculture, but across the board in India, farmers really don't know what's going on, right? So they've inherited growing food. They have small pieces of land, very small pieces of land compared to any other part of the world. It's very disorganized. And it's more a craft-oriented way that you understand. So your great-grandfather had this plot of land, you figured out how the seasons worked, and you would start planting, and then you left everything to chance. And I felt that, technology, especially if you, in today's day and age where technology is accessible and cheap, if you had the right kind of sensors, the Internet of Things kind of a model, then maybe that would be something that would really empower farmers to be able to do things individually on their own and also locally. I'm a big fan of local. I'm a real big fan of local, small communities, because that's where I think real innovation happens, and that's where the actual problems are, where innovation needs to be done. In a top-down, policy-driven approach kind of a thing, I don't think is going to work anywhere in the world, much less so in a country like India, which is the hotbed of diversity and stuff like that. So sorry, but that was a very long introduction, but I thought it was needed.
Okay, thank you. So Eric, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yeah, Eric, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So, yeah, I've been interested in Klaus's discussions and other calls, and I am going to be at a homeowners association meeting tomorrow night, and I want to try to present the topic. I think just bringing up the topic of food security is tricky among most people. I mean, people are thinking for their own families, and like, what kind of atmosphere is it? Like, is this town going to work with each other and to plan ahead and just, yeah, getting contact information for each other? It's really a process, and I got to see where my town is in the process.
You bet.
I'm here to learn.
All right, then, well, thank you, Eric. Gene, you want to go?
I'm Gene Ballinger. I live in the Outer Banks in North Carolina in the US. And Klaus and I have been around and around about this topic for years now, I think.
That's it.
And I'm to say I'm a firm believer is sort of a understatement. I currently have at least 60 edible plants growing in my office that I eat some of every day. And there's a picture that a ping that I posted in the chat that has always fascinated me of a town in Switzerland. And if you look at it, every single backyard has got a garden in it.
Yeah.
That's why I'm here. Oh, and I'm a recovering systems thinker, but that's a long story.
Recovering systems thinker.
Absolutely.
I like that. I like that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, following up on what Eric is saying, I was wondering, how would you go about talking about the food and agriculture in relationship to climate change? Let's say you meet an acquaintance who is sort of lukewarm on climate change, is not opposed, but doesn't really know much about it. And so you're starting a conversation on climate change, and then you want to bring in the importance of food and agriculture in the context of fixing or mitigating for climate change. How do you talk about this? How do you engage in that conversation? Did we have you? Go ahead.
Ask them if they enjoy inflation. And do they think it's going to get better or worse? I mean, they're continually paying more and more for groceries on a monthly basis, and that's only going to get worse.
When you
Quite
do
some time
that,
to come.
Kind of. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead,
I was
Stacey.
just going to say, when you do that, they immediately go to politics, and that's not the direction that I think is going to work.
So my sense is that, climate change, inflation, it's too far removed. And I'm not talking just about the India perspective. I think generally at a human level, it's too abstract and too remote for people to think that it directly affects them. So I guess what we probably need to do is to start breaking this journey down into trying and finding out what is the most proximate thing that people can relate to. And if they can relate to it, then we take the next step. So it's nice to be able to talk about it. And most people think that, this is meant for the World Economic Forum or the UN or the government to do. It has nothing to do with them. I mean, even if they were to be able to figure out what is it that they can do, either to improve the situation at a macro level or even in their own lives. So my sense is that if we could take up the challenge on trying to, build this so-called journey that the person is going through, or anybody is going through, and try to find out what's the most proximate and therefore relevant to everybody, then you got them, then the trick, I guess, is for them to start asking questions than for us to go on and on about saying, it's a big bad world and nothing's working. And, 200 years down the line, my great grandchildren are not going to. So that rhetoric is not really working. That's my sense.
Yeah. So this proximity and context, Eric, what do your folks think? Or how would you approach talking about foods in general within the context of soil and water and anything that's related to food. Yeah.
So like I'm in a town in Pennsylvania and there's grocery stores that seem to have recovered from the previous supply chain issues. So it's not on people's minds. There are farmers markets and they are fully stocked too. So I don't think it's urgent in the minds of people yet, but there are like conservation programs for water. I've seen some local things. So yeah, I mean, it seems like everything, people think that everything is okay for now. The question is, when will they start worrying, or when can the community get together and prepare for things like what we see now, like in Somalia, there's a famine. I mean, when will that reach us? It's a mentality shift. So it's really, okay, so there's individuals and families that have to be ready, but then will the community come together? That's the issue. Because there are models like in Africa that we could look at, things that are working. I just don't see it translating yet to the US, but maybe there are other, maybe Europe is suffering something soon, or we'll learn from Europe. I don't know.
Stacey.
Eric has put something in the chat, which I think is worth looking at, right? The discussion of food security can be independent of views of climate change, just looking at the supply chain issues. So I think we should table that and also talk about that. It could be a direction we could discuss.
Yeah.
Stacey, sorry.
Yeah, I want to go back to what Gene said, because he has a point. The financial angle is a really good way to hit your average person. And a while back, maybe a year now, I remember, Klaus, you were talking, well, it was a group that was talking about the possibility of organizing like the institutions in a neighborhood, the hospitals, the restaurants. Does that sound familiar to you?
Yeah, that's my constant stick here. Yeah.
Yeah, to me, that was like, especially in my town where, you know, I'm in a walking town. We're filled with restaurants, churches, and a hospital all within blocks of each other, and a farmer's market. And that's something that I think is a way that reaches the people that maybe not necessarily care about climate change, but their own self-interest. But at the same time, it also reaches the people that are interested in climate change. And at the same time, it weaves those groups together. And, you know, everything is always about, you know, for me, it's about belonging and getting people to be more connected to each other. So, you know, I didn't want to skip over what Gene said, because that's really important. I just don't use the word inflation because that triggers politics in their mind. But I do talk about, I try to come up with a situation, you know, and make it just more, you know, like I think about kids and schools and, you know, doing an activity together and starting it like that. Like we used to have vegan nights, or, you know, just some kind of, you know, what could we do to do this together?
Yeah.
And Stacey's right. If you follow the journey of Pam Warhurst and what they did in Todmorden in the UK, okay? So a few people got together and said, food is important for our future. Maybe we should do something about it. So they started small and they just started doing it. In other words, they didn't go trying to get lots of people involved and lots of okay from people. They just started doing stuff. And little by little, it grew until Todmorden became, the town became a food forest. So that all of the shops in town have food growing in front of them. There's corn growing in front of the police station. There's food growing in front of the hospital. And it got to the point where the school teaches nutrition and the school has its own gardens and the students learn to plant and harvest the food to eat. And it's just, it's an amazing story. Here's a TED Talk. I think it's a TED Talk. One of many about Todd Morton, and the approach was actually replicated in numerous towns across the UK and in other towns around the world.
Yeah, I mean, there's some great examples here in the US as well of communities that have developed, sometimes centered around a university, like Sacramento has created a food hub with a huge central kitchen, commissary kitchen, and their own farms. So they deploy several hundred people in these farms there. So yeah, so that's but how do you get people to be motivated, to get into this? I mean, what Eric wants to do tomorrow is go in front of a group of people and get them interested in looking at food from a perspective of what, Eric? Food security, climate change.
Yeah, I'm thinking really just my local community. If there is a food emergency in my community, what will people do? And is there a way we could prepare by working with farmers markets or Amish and securing our food supply, and just even general, just knowing our neighbors and any special needs they have. So we could prepare, at least start the process.
Yeah, that's awesome. So Neil, you wanted to jump in on what Eric was saying.
No, I think I agree with what he's saying. I think there's a little bit of disconnect in my head because the context is very different, right? So I agree with what Eric's. I think each one of us has a different way to skin this cat, and right now I think Eric has the most immediate need, which I think in today's call might make sense for us to quickly see if we can help, like you've taken over, Klaus, to say that what can we do. And I think, Eric, that's a great approach.
Yeah, you also have such an advantage because if you're next to the Amish country, then people have an idea of what it means to have locally grown organic food. So I spent a week in the Amish country in the New York area there, upstate, and the food is just amazing because they have groomed their soil now, and everything is prepped and processed locally. So you have a head start in a way that people can visualize what you're talking about.
Yes.
Now, if you live in a city, then that's a whole lot more difficult to achieve. But I think where we are going here is to find a context-specific story. So you're talking, like in my own community here in Bend, I'm trying to get something started, and this is a sophisticated little town. It's like Colorado Springs, so it's a ski resort, vacation resort, and people are quite into growing food and eating local and all of that. But still, to advance that thinking, what is your understanding of food, the system, agriculture, and so on in the context of environment and climate change? How do you understand that?
Are you asking me?
Or
someone else? Yeah, okay. Okay, well, I understand the supply chain and how it could get easily disrupted, because most people just go to the supermarket and get whatever they want. But there are local farmers markets that people buy local, and there are like health food stores where they have local sections, so people could choose those. So it's a question of really getting people to think about planning for the future and migrating towards local sources. So, I mean, in terms of climate, it's not on people's minds right now. I think yeah, we are aware of the global issues, but it's not personal yet. You know, we may be seeing hints of it coming. So, yeah, there'll be refugees in the future. So we don't know. We don't know the impact on our lives, and maybe like the Philadelphia area might be thinking about that. You got to find the groups of people who think alike. So yeah, I'm just thinking, okay, what makes sense right now just to spread awareness among my local community and see if there are some things we could start looking at. But that's just protecting us. But see, like we're a town, we're not a city. There's a different mindset for a city that's needed. And they are, like, colleges do have like food co-ops for city people. I've seen that. Like in Delaware, there's a university town, University of Delaware, where they do have food co-ops. So there are little pockets of change happening, but it's not in the general consciousness yet. It's like, okay, we survived COVID, we made it through, it's over. That mindset is like it's over.
Yeah.
It's not over.
I think another thing, Klaus, we might be really worth our while, and maybe this is something that I can kick off a little bit of this, is that we understand, as people who have been concerned with the connections between food and climate change and environment and all of that. We understand all of this, and it's very close to our heart, and that's one of the reasons why I think most of us are really frustrated about the speed and the fact that nobody's thinking about it. But my sense is that most of the people don't even know what these elements are, right? So when you ask about the connection, I don't really understand food and food security. Forget about its connection to climate change. So one of the things I think would be very, very useful is to actually become a knowledge broker. And I'm using your own term, right?
Yeah.
To become a knowledge broker at a local level and contextualize it, because I'm sure people would want to pick that up in smaller pieces, digestible pieces. So for example, let me just try and play out an example. One of the things that I learned when we got into the hydroponics business, something that attracted me to hydroponics was not just the fancy term and the fact that it was technology driven. I found out that in hydroponics, although the word says hydroponics, you would expect it to have, would not expect it to have such an impact on water, for example, right? So when you learn about hydroponics, you find 2 or 3 very, very powerful messages that you can communicate. One, of course, is that it uses only 5 to 10% of the water of soil-based agriculture. Hardly anybody knows that, because it's a closed cycle loop, right?
Right.
Second, because it's hydroponics, it gives time for everything to be done with the soil, and you don't really need the soil. So soil gets time to breathe and to regenerate and stuff like that. Number 3, it's very easy for you to do, even if you don't have. So typically, the mindset of people is that if you're getting into agriculture, you need to start with an acreage of land. And that's one thing that gets completely trashed when you think of hydroponics, because you don't need land for hydroponics. You just need a piece, even a balcony space is good enough for you to be able to start growing stuff, And then the 4th thing that I found out or discovered as we kept going along was that traditional agriculture has this, it's limited by the footprint on which you're trying to grow your crops, right? And in aquaponics, hydroponics, the technology, soilless type of agriculture, you can actually grow vertical. So Singapore has done this very beautifully. Like they have, they have a shortage of space, which means that this would be a fantastic opportunity for a city like New York, for example, right? Because you can grow farms vertically. And now everywhere in the East, you find people doing these experiments in places like Dubai and Hong Kong and in Singapore, where they've got these green buildings where things are growing around all over the building, right? They've got crops growing on balconies and flowing over the balconies and stuff like that. So it's changing even the architecture. So my point here was that if we can just get some of these stories. I think a lot of what communication has to do with powerful storytelling. So how do we get stories started, and then how can we get a bunch of people that can tell these stories in a way that, people relate to them, and then they start talking to them and build their own stories out of them.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with this, because there is one thing about knowing the big picture technical structure, but then it means something different in every community that you're living within, and even people you're talking with. Hi, Pete. We just started to go
Hi, Pete.
around saying, how would you communicate to someone, to an acquaintance, that you are getting into a climate change conversation with about food and what food means in this context? So I think climate is probably going to be it's too much, right? I mean, the moment you get into climate change, then you're losing a lot of audience. But one thing that we have resorted to in communications, like with the business climate leaders, and so when I do webinars, we don't talk about climate change anymore, but we do talk about changing weather patterns. So it rains less often, leading to periods of drought, but then it comes down when it rains much harder than it usually does. And it comes down onto a dry soil. It bounces off the soil. It doesn't sink in because the soil is depleted, and it runs off and it takes the topsoil with it. And so we don't necessarily talk about why these weather patterns have changed so much, but everyone watching has heard about these prolonged droughts that are going on, and then flooding everywhere because of these rainfalls that are so intense, right? And then that we are leading that then into soil, and how the restoration of soil increases the water holding capacity of the soil, and then at the same time also the absorption rate. So that's like way too much. Gene just froze up. Grace, what do you think?
Grace?
I'm sorry, Stacy. I mean, sorry, I'm gonna have a meeting with Grace right after this. Stacy.
No, I was just thinking, I wonder if the way to switch the mindset would be to focus people on what are the solutions for planting in order to adapt for these changing patterns. Because in that way, you're pointing out the changing patterns without pointing them out. Like, you're not saying, oh, look what's happening. You're taking that as a given, and it's getting into their subconscious simply by asking them, how can we change the way we're doing things? What I'm saying making sense? Like, do you know what I'm articulating?
Yes, absolutely. No,
Okay.
you articulated it beautifully.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Pete, how do you go about, what do you say if you want to explain to someone that they should be paying attention to food, where they buy it from and what they're consuming?
It's an interesting question, because I kind of have a preference to eat vegan, and that's a whole nother can of worms, kind of. So a lot of times I just kind of stay away from the conversation. But there's an interesting thing. You said climate is too much, and in a way, food is too much too. It's just that it has an easier, everybody has to eat. Not everybody has to think about climate. So you can get somebody's attention, and you can say, okay, imagine food. Imagine that you're getting food from the supermarket. Imagine the couple steps before that. It got trucked to the supermarket. It came out of the ground, right? And there was a farmer or set of people that made it come out of the ground. So it's conceptually easier, even though either one is kind of a wicked problem, right? If it's easy to get into the food discussion and talk about why we're eating industrialized food, and why industrialized food is cheaper than nutritious food and things like that. So they can both get overwhelming quickly. So part of the trick is not to get overwhelmed by a big thing. It's maybe not that food is necessarily simpler, but it feels simpler. It's easier to start with, and you can do something. You can think about it in an interesting way without getting too deep.
Yeah, I mean, the reason why this is so important is that I'm going from one webinar to another, one conversation to the next with a group of NGOs. Jean, are you here? Can you hear us, Jean? Okay, hold on. You're back.
Yeah, I lost my internet for some reason, but it's back now.
You're back, okay. Is that in the farming community, they're really beginning to understand how scary this whole thing is, because if you're farming in California, I mean, you're flat out of water in some regions, right? And then you have these periods of drought where your soil just cracks up. In other areas, in the Carolinas and so on, you're flooded, and your crop gets devastated because it's underwater. So the farmer needs to do things differently, and they know what to do, right? I mean, they have to change out types of crops, they have to rotate crops and what have you. But if the consumer doesn't understand what's going on, right? If the market isn't ready for it, then the farmer doesn't have a market to sell into, right? So there is this push-pull kind of thing. So you need an educated consumer who understands that what we eat and where we source it from has an impact on helping farmers to restore their soil back to health. And so this is why I'm asking, how do you see this in your own life, and how would you explain this to someone? You're just meat. It doesn't matter whether it's vegan, or meat eater, or what have you. Go ahead, James.
Okay, so I spent years, almost decades, as an absolutely terrible consultant, all right? And it really bothered me. I was so bad at it. And someone once told me that part of the reason that we screwed up all the time is we got the sequence out of order. They said, you have to know what, you have to know why, and you have to care why, and then know how. And we always skip step 3, okay? So that we say, this is what, this is why, and here's how you do it. So we don't connect with people on an emotional level so that they actually give a shit, all right? So in terms of, there's a really marvelous book by the Heath brothers called Moments or something like that. And they said that you need to take a clear insight compressed in time, delivered in a manner that allows the audience to discover it. Okay? So that I once wrote this paper called Change Management, the Columbo Approach. Any of you remember Columbo, the TV detective? He had this way of continually discounting himself and asking other people to help him understand. So he never went to tell anybody anything. He was always, confused about what was going on, trying to get other people to help him understand. And people actually like to be helpful, okay? Now, if I come to you and decide that I have to tell you something that you really don't want to hear, maybe you passively listen to me a little bit, but you really don't care. Though if I come to you and say, I've really been concerned about this, and it's really beginning to bother me, and this is what's bothering me, and this is why, I mean, for years, I tried to get people to develop models, okay, and finally decided that modeling is an unnatural act for most people. And so I'd go to the customer and say, well, to really understand this problem and figure out how to deal with it, we need to build a model. Well, the customer doesn't know how to build a model and isn't interested, and they become defensive, and we don't get very far. So I finally realized that if I go to the customer and I'm not there to help, I'm there for them to help me understand their problem, because they understand it far better than I ever will. So I ask them to walk me through and understand what it is they're wrestling with. And as they're telling me, I say, can I take some notes? And I start taking notes, but my notes look like a model, but I don't ever tell them that. I mean, it's like the first rule of Fight Club is not to talk about Fight Club. So the first rule of modeling is don't talk about models. And I'm taking notes, and after a few minutes, I'll begin to ask questions based upon my notes. And it's really amazing that after about 15 minutes, the client's saying, you know, we really ought to add this piece over here and connect it to this, and we should, and doesn't this connect to this? And in 15 minutes, you got them developing a model. I call it the stealth approach to modeling. And it works really well. And I think it's the same way with food insecurity or whatever. I mean, we have a tendency to believe change is linear until we realize that it's exponential. And it just, I mean, companies go out of business slowly for a long period of time and then all at once. It's like the calmest place in the river is just before the falls. So I'm done.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate this. So you're basically teasing out what the person you're talking with knows about their own circumstances. And they may not have put the dots together, they may not have made connections between the things that they know, but you teased out what they do know, and then you can really help them connect that into a mental model. Is that what I hear you say?
Mm-hmm. Pretty much.
Yeah.
But I mean, the part of the problem is we always want to be the white knight that rides in on the horse and saves the day because we know the answer. Well, it doesn't work most of the time because people just become defensive.
So intuitively, what I see happening is that people are becoming very aware of forest fires, prolonged droughts, empty reservoirs, aquifers running dry, crazy rains that swamp the city. So those are all things that are connected to the way we farm, because the way we farm destroys basically the water absorption capacity of the soil. Plus the chemical runoffs from these agricultural fields destroy watersheds, create algal blooms and so on. So that's the technical background. But how do you connect that in somebody's mind to all this crazy stuff is happening here, and we could mitigate it by introducing different farming practices, growing food that is actually sequestering carbon into the soil, enriching the soil.
Well, the approach has to be different for different people. I mean, if you watch some of the Gabe Brown videos on YouTube, and there's dozens and dozens of them, you know, he goes and talks to the farmer and he hits them where it actually emotionally connects with them in terms of their pocketbook. So he explains to them why, if they do regenerative farming with cover crops and his 7 principles, that it actually costs less to actually plant the fields and costs less to maintain them and less to harvest them. And the soil actually develops in the process. So if it costs them less and they make more money, it begins to make sense to them. And he's got an argument, which is real hard for them to disagree with. And he says, if you say that it will work on my farm and not on your farm, I'll bet my farm against your farm that I can get it to work here. And if you want to take up the bet, I'll get another farm.
Yeah. So what we're trying to explore is how do you get people in a conversation to come to that point where you can talk about this?
Tell them you're confused, you're concerned. You know, I've listened to all these news stories about all of the forest fires and concerned about what it's going to do to the crop yields and is it going to continue to cost us more for food in the future? And there must be something that we can do about it.
Yeah.
What do you think? I don't know what the answer is. Even if I did, I wouldn't tell you.
Yeah, creating that linkage without running into defenses, like mentioning climate change, you're running into a wall. So how to bring that about, to explain in a constructive way that the way we farm is taking out our topsoil, or it's depleting our topsoil of carbon. I mean, there's one statistic that I find really gets people's attention. For every 1% of carbon that you add into the soil can hold another 20,000 gallons of water per acre. And the absorption rate of the soil increases by as much as 8 inches per minute. So go ahead.
There's no better example of that than The Biggest Little Farm. It's an
Exactly.
amazing video. I probably watched it a half a dozen times. That when the rain came and everybody else's topsoil washed away, theirs held, and all the water went back into the aquifer.
Yeah. Yeah. So to bring something like this into a casual conversation that creates an interest, or if Eric, you're talking to a group of people, to present this in ways that resonates. But I see that the water holding capacity of soil plus the increased absorption rate. Right now, if you live in the Carolinas, that's a really important statistic. And it's the same for California, because they get massive rains and the soil can't absorb it because the soil doesn't have any carbon in it and it runs off. So Neil, you have been quiet. What are your thoughts?
I've been listening because I'm just trying to also make sure that I'm getting the context of what's being discussed here. And this last bit, I see a small disconnect here, that this is very powerful and it will catch everybody's attention. But I still come back to my point that from the end consumer's perspective, it's not something that he or she is really has any control over or can make a difference to his or her life, right? So I think this is a very powerful thing to tell the farmer, because it affects his business. But I still come back to my very first point, that this is too large when I walk into a supermarket and I'm buying that can of peas, for example. It's not in my head. This kind of a technical powerful thing is not in my head. I'm only looking at what is the price of this and how many of these do I need to put into my shopping cart, right? So I guess, one of the things that we need to do is to create that linkage. And like Jean also pointed out, I think that was a very powerful story where I think he was very self-effacing about the way he put it, but we all react very emotionally. All the logic that comes into our head, we agree with all of that, but when we have to behave or when we act only from what we feel at that point of time, right? So, and I think storytelling is a great way for us to, and there are methods of storytelling, right? It could be a story that you're saying impromptu in a gathering like Eric is going to, or it could be like a small, 3-minute video that's created, right?
Right.
But that's where the power, I think, will rest. And because these have a tremendous amount of viral component, we also want to scale the impactful conversations, right? So if we just do it through traditional means, it's not going to happen that well, or we're just going to then wait for chance. I think these are a few points.
The Heath brothers also talk about the logical rider on the emotional elephant. Okay. So
Yes, that's
the amount of control is extremely limited. So that, and we, though sometimes we're just too damn smart for our own good, and we attempt to convince people from a logical perspective. And that was why they said in moments that you have to tell this story to them that enables them to make an emotional connection.
Yes, exactly.
One of the amazing stories that he told was about this CEO who's been trying to get people to participate in the 401k program for years, and he's just not having a lot of luck. So finally, he gets this whole pile of money and he puts it on a conference table in the conference room, and he calls all these people in, and they're all sitting there, and he says to them, "This is the money that went in my pocket the end of last year because you didn't participate. The end of next year, do you want this money in my pocket or your pocket?" End of story. Okay.
Very powerful.
Yeah.
Very powerful. And I think, Gene, you know what you're saying, this actually can be a small little video clip, and going by what's happening on TikTok and WhatsApp these days, you know, to your point, Klaus, these kind of things actually go viral, you know, and then they stick in people's heads and they become conversation starters. So what happens is that whatever we try to seed or do, I think our job should be just to seed these and break them down into small digestible things that people can understand. We need to dumb it down to quite an extent. Otherwise, it's too far away from people's daily lives, is what I think. But this is just a guess from a US perspective. I mean, in India, it's very different, right?
Sure. Yeah, I found the connection through water. So we focused in our first webinars now on soil, and soil is pretty complex. To understand the soil microbiota and carbon sequestration through photosynthesis, I mean, you lose people really fast. But water is really close to everyone, right? If you're in California, water means one thing. If you're in Florida, it means another thing, right? So you have areas, excessive drought, you have areas with excessive precipitation, you have areas where the water is so polluted you can't touch it, right? The Mississippi River Delta washing into the Gulf of Mexico, creating these enormous dead zones. So water has a much closer emotional connection than soil to the person who's not really studying these issues. So then you can get into explaining that in order to fix water, that's really the farmer. So in the high desert in Oregon, for example, 86% of the water is used by farmers. So on a global average is something like 72% of all water is used for farming. And in many regions, now it hits the agricultural regions, it hits 80+%. So the media has successfully excluded farmers from considerations of water. So most people don't link the beaches of Florida being green and having thousands of fish washed up on the beach with farm chemicals running down the Mississippi River Delta. Or if you're on Lake Erie or actually anywhere, and you have watersheds that you have toxins, so you have cities spending millions of dollars to upgrade their water filtration system, but they don't understand the link comes from these farmers putting synthetic fertilizers onto the fields and phosphates that wash into the waterways. So we are looking for these connections, where you start by saying, here's an issue, right? And here is the link to it. And that's the American public, at least, really has very little understanding of where my food comes from, how it's being grown, and what impact that has on my personal health and then the health of the environment. but it's yeah, wetland protection area, absolutely. I mean, I think each region of the US has some kind of concern with water, and for different reasons. And so we found that the most unifying way to message, into a population, that way you like to bring people to the table of thinking about these connections, with the ultimately with climate change, but you don't need to go there.
So one of
I
the things
would-
I really liked about what Gene, sorry, Gene, you want to go first?
No, go ahead. No.
So one of the things that I really think we should attempt is what Gene had said, right? So we have this whole ammunition of being able to explain this to various people, whether it's the farming community, the farmers, or the end consumers, etc., right? But how about we kind of stay silent in a conversation where we flip the entire thing over and say, tell me your story. How do you buy food? What are the considerations when you buy food? And we start noting down. I think I love that approach, because we already have the answers with us, right? And we know how we can connect them depending on what comes out from the other side. It's going to be a completely different approach. It's not something we are used to, so we need to change our habits of communication as well. And we may want to try out something like that. It's worth even documenting, and I think my gut or intuitive feel is that it will really work very well.
Yeah. So go ahead.
So if I wanted to take a town and turn the town into a food forest, wouldn't the best way to start be to turn my yard into a food forest? As an example for others to, rather than go try to convince other people to do this. Shouldn't I demonstrate it? That picture that I posted on the chat of that town in Switzerland.
Switzerland, yeah, I saw that, yeah.
Every single yard
Backyard,
is
yes.
a food forest, all right? I mean, it's just. So once people see it, okay, and they see you getting a lot of your food from your yard as opposed to going to the store and buying it, and they say, wow, isn't that a lot of work? And you say, no, just I spend, an hour every couple of days and I reap all of these benefits from doing this. And the next question will be, well, can you show me how to do this? And the answer is absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, the victory gardens, like Eric is saying here, 40% of food during World War II came out of these victory gardens. I mean, it's just stunning when you think about this, right? So we have absolutely the capacity to go back and secure ourselves with food if enough people begin to understand and see this as an option or as a need, right? Yeah, I'm looking at the movie. Actually, I wanted to pick up on the Biggest Little Farm movie, and Gene already posted it here. But there's another movie that I would like you to see, which is The Right to Harm. And so that's sort of the opposite of the positive message, of the Biggest Little Farm. Because what the Biggest Little Farm demonstrates is that a multi-crop farm with integrated livestock is the most efficient form of farming, period. So the industry will tell us that yield per acre is much bigger and better when they do the monocrop production. But and that's true, the yield per acre is higher, but the calories per acre in a multi-crop farm with integrated livestock is much superior, because you have different crops, you have tree crops. If you engage agroforestry, which is what the Biggest Little Farm did, and you're using all your byproducts to feed animals who then provide free protein, basically. right? Because you can use produce that is left over in the fields. You use, if you have carrots, you use the green of the carrots to feed it, to the animals. So there are such efficiencies. But then you look at concentrated animal feeding operations, and you see, the amazing damage that does, and so this is sort of the negative side of things. So what I was suggesting is, well, let's do this again, but could you watch both movies if you haven't watched them yet? The Biggest Little Farm is on Netflix, or you can just rent it, I think, for like $4 or so. And The Right to Harm, there is the website here. It's a really powerful film. The Sierra Club is just using it right now to bring awareness and attention to the way that we handle our animals, the way we raise livestock. What else would you suggest? I mean, so I wanted to carry this in here. So really the intention is, how can we message, how can we create storylines that that connect with people, either positively, meaning here's some wonderful stuff we could be doing, or scary, look at what's happening here and how destructive this is.
I posted a link to How I Fell in Love with a Fish, which is a TED Talk
Yeah,
by,
great title.
and it's about the creation of a 27,000 acre fish farm in southern Spain, which was a failed Argentinian cattle ranch. And the guy that created it, the Dan Barber, who is a 5-star chef from New York City, was there touring the farm, and Miguel, who set all this up, was giving him a tour and telling about all this stuff. And Barber said to him, "Where'd you learn so much about fish?" Miguel says, "I don't know anything about fish. I'm an expert in relationships." Think about that. All right.
Absolutely. So I have a suggestion.
Yeah.
To track what we are doing on this, should we just create a small Slack group so that we can post in links and then it's all available there?
Yeah, I will.
Is that a good way to do it? Because I'm we'll all save the chat and we'll have the links available. So on my side, I just need a quick disclaimer that sometimes I've noticed when people have recommended movies and stuff on Netflix and other such places, except on YouTube, sometimes this content is really not available in this part of the world. They block some of this. So I'll just quickly take a look. If I have any issues with that, I'll let you know. So if I'm not able to see those, I think TED Talks should not be a problem at all because they're open across the world. It's just these OTT, the Netflix and people like that, they have different policies for different parts of the world.
Here's the Biggest Little Farm movie at their direct website. So if you don't have Netflix, that's where you can get the movie directly. But if you haven't seen it, do watch it. It's phenomenal, because it really is state-of-the-art regenerative farming. It's a wonderful movie. And then maybe we can pick it up from there next week. And so what were your impressions watching this, The Biggest Little Farm, and then followed by The Right to Harm as a contrast. So we're on top of the hour. I just scheduled 60 minutes. And let's see how it goes. Great. I mean,
it was a great idea. Thanks for doing this, Klaus. I think it was a great idea, and let's see if this can make a difference. We can start with conversations, but I liked what Jean said at the beginning of this call. Let's get into action as soon as possible, even if it's in a very small way. Otherwise, we just keep going on with conversations.
Yeah,
and I'm happy to do parts of or start leading the action. I come from Gandhi's country anyway, so.
Very good. yeah, let's see where it takes us. Definitely, you know. So
Right.
I'm completely open, and I would love to stay focused on the consumer side of things. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Educating
Yes,
the
I think,
general public. Yeah.
yeah, I think that's a great place to be, and I think that's where the focus should be, because if we can create a pull from the consumer, then everything works.
Yes.
The push isn't working so well.
Yeah. Very good. Stacy, any
Didn't-
last comments?
Didn't somebody say, be the change you want to see in the world?
That's
Yeah,
right.
that was Gandhi. That was Gandhi.
Okay. Well, thank you. Hi, Sarah. We didn't. So Sarah is with Business Climate Leaders, so we are partnered there. All right, guys. I'm going to end it. Thank you. We'll
Yeah.
see you again next
Thank
week.
you very much.
I'll post the video.
Thanks all.
Yeah,
Yes,
thank you.
please.
Nice
Bye.
meeting you guys. Thanks.
Bye bye.